Hello, I'm Anjali Vyas from the University of Michigan, and I'm going to be talking about a fascinating project I worked on in my last year as an undergrad, where my team and I investigated the filtering of COVID-19 websites. This work was possible thanks to the amazing Ramsundar Raman, Nick Sessio, and Joya Ensafi from the University of Michigan, and also the amazing Philip Losha from the University of Oslo. I think I can speak for all of us when I say the pandemic made us scramble to find information on the internet about how we should keep ourselves and others around us safe. Personally, I check websites almost every day to find the number of COVID-19 cases in my area. The fact of the matter is that because of the pandemic, finding correct information is a matter of direct safety for all of us now. This is why our team had the question: is potentially useful information about COVID-19 inaccessible to people? Is this information experiencing censorship? And by censorship, here I mean access to certain websites being blocked. A few limited reports have actually highlighted some cases of blocking of COVID-19 information. One such example is the study in Myanmar. Around a year ago in Myanmar, internet service providers were told to block 230 websites by government authorities who claimed it was because they contained fake COVID-19 stories. But some seemingly harmless websites are also being blocked. There's a lack of transparency about what was being blocked and exactly why it was being blocked. Previous studies such as this one only focused on measuring COVID-19 internet censorship of specific websites and only in specific regions. But we wanted to widen the scope and see what was happening globally with a large array of domains. We specifically wanted to focus on investigating the censorship of COVID-19 content that was factual or content that would be potentially useful to people. We hope to get answers to questions like, where are potentially useful COVID-19 websites being blocked? How common is this blocking? And finally, we also wanted to understand what categories these blocked websites belong to. And now I wanted to give you a brief idea about how we went about actually tackling these questions. So first, we selected COVID-19 search terms that people might use to find useful websites online. Then we performed search engine crawls with them in different locations to find the top URLs that show up when these terms are actually searched. From these top URLs, we gathered the top 20 from each location to get a list of domains for testing. And then finally, we tested reachability into these domains from different parts of the world using our censorship measurement techniques, SQUAC and Satellite. Now I'm going to talk about each of these steps in more detail. We first needed to figure out which domains we wanted to test for reachability. So we used Google Trends to get a list of search terms meant to get factual information on COVID-19 in search engines. And this is because it shows the most common user searches related to the pandemic. We noticed that most of these popular search terms had the word coronavirus followed by another word or the name of the country. So our 81 search terms ended up looking something like this. Next, we performed search engine crawls with Google, Bing, and DuckDuckGo. And because we didn't want our results to be biased to one area, we did this in 9 geo-distributed vantage points to find the top URLs that show up when these terms are actually searched. Then, we found the union of the top 20 URLs in each location to make our test list of 1,291 domains. We call this our COVID-related test list. A lot of websites in this list were popular, like New York Times, for instance. And even though not all of their content is COVID-19 specific, when we did our measurements, they covered a lot of vital pandemic content and news that people read a lot. We also noticed that several of the COVID-related websites, like covidlive.co.uk, for instance, contain the words COVID, Corona, or Corona with a K. We wanted to eventually look at the censorship of such websites in isolation because they clearly started existing only after the pandemic started and had very COVID-19 specific content. So all COVID-related websites with these 3 words in their name make up our COVID-containing test list. We also wanted to compare the level of censorship between these 2 lists I just described and a list of around 2,000 sensitive and popular domains from Citizen Lab and Alexa whose reachability is measured very often by censorship measurement platforms. We called this list the Censorship Measurement Control List. After we had our list of domains, we needed to actually test whether people from around the world could access them. The most common method previous studies have adopted to measure censorship is what we call direct measurement. This is where the researcher somehow gets access to a client in the country of interest to run reachability measurements. The clients could be volunteers running a particular software or an accessible machine like a VPN server. Now, direct measurements have been very useful, but they struggle with some inherent challenges, especially when it comes to global measurement. Some of these include, for example, the tremendous effort and community involvement required to get a large number of volunteers, or the issue of coordinating tests and making sure ethical precautions are taken for volunteers. In comparison, Recently developed remote censorship measurement techniques allow for much safer and large-scale measurements. The idea here is to infer if two devices on the internet can talk to each other without actually controlling either of these devices. My lab's project, the Censored Planet Observatory, develops and uses these remote measurement techniques to collect global internet censorship measurements for building an accurate view of what is not accessible in different parts of the world. Our study also relied on Censored Planet's remote measurement techniques to understand the reachability of websites in our test lists. And this is because they allow large-scale global reachability tests with many vantage points and without the ethical concerns of direct measurement. In particular, we used Quack, which measures keyword blocking at the application layer using echo servers, and Satellite, which measures censorship relying on DNS manipulation. And now I'm going to show you how these two techniques work. DNS manipulation usually results in a wrong IP returned as a result for a DNS query. The censor may be in the path or may control or have poisoned the DNS resolver. The client receives a wrong IP that may host a block page, for instance. And this is known to be a very common type of censorship since DNS queries are usually sent in plain text, and this is why they are easy to identify and block. Okay, so how do we measure this type of censorship? Well, first, Satellite finds all ethical resolvers through internet-wide scanning. Next, it uses OpenDNS resolvers as vantage points to perform measurements. From our measurement machine at the University of Michigan, we first send a DNS query for a domain we're interested in to a DNS resolver in the country of interest. At the same time, we also send DNS requests to multiple control resolvers that are trusted. To detect DNS manipulation, then we use a bunch of heuristics to compare features of the test measurement represented by arrows 1 and 2 and the control measurement represented by arrows 3 and 4. These heuristics, which are designed to detect instances of interference and avoid false inference, include a direct IP comparison, comparison of content hashes, TLS certificates, autonomous system numbers, and so on. And for a measurement to be marked as an anomaly, all the heuristics have to mismatch between the test and control measurements. Quack, on the other hand, uses echo service to detect DPI blocking of traffic based on request headers. An echo service simply sends back any data it receives on port 7 to the originating source. So if we send a GET request from our measurement machine to an echo server for example.com, a website that no one is trying to target, then we should get the very same thing back from the server. But if we test for censorship with a more sensitive keyword, and if there is a censor on the path from us to the echo server that is censoring the sensitive keyword, the response we will receive will be different from the expected, essentially reflected response. And this will allow us to detect censorship. Using these two censorship techniques to measure the reachability of domains in our test list over 2 weeks in June 2020, and after we removed false positives manually, we were able to get a total of 153 million measurements in a large number of countries and autonomous systems. So now I want to dive straight into our findings. The good news is that the global average blocking rate of our measured COVID-19 related websites was relatively low. On average, only 0.2 to 0.31% of websites experience some form of interference, which is lower compared to an average blocking rate of 0.7 to around 1% for the censorship measurement control list. But there were still high levels of censorship of COVID-19 content in a considerable number of countries. In the figure here, each dot represents a country. So the higher the dot, the greater the average blocking rate for the country. The labeled countries show blocking that is higher than 90% of blocking observed in all countries. The countries are also ordered on the x-axis by their internet freedom score, which means that the more to the left a country or dot is, the more free it is considered in terms of internet freedom. This particular graph shows the average DNS filtering of COVID-related websites for countries, which is measured with Satellite. You can see here that countries which typically have high levels of internet censorship, such as China and Iran, observed high DNS filtering of COVID-related websites. And this is also true for application layer filtering. Looking into it more, we found that in these countries, censorship was predominantly focusing on news websites or social media websites. And even though such websites may not focus on COVID-19 content, this is still concerning because they are often important sources of information about it. Observing such censorship in less free countries was rather expected for us, but we were surprised to find high average blocking rates of COVID-related websites than you expected in several free countries, like Switzerland and Croatia, as you can see here in this graph, which shows average DNS filtering rates. This average blocking is even higher for free countries when we look at DNS filtering of COVID-containing websites. Remember, these websites contain pandemic-specific information. We also observed a similar trend for the application layer filtering of COVID-containing websites, with countries like Canada having higher average blocking than expected. Observing this made us want to dig deeper into the censorship occurring in some of these countries to see exactly what could be causing it. In Switzerland, we had a large number of vantage points. To be precise, we had 922 distributed across 34 autonomous systems. We found our vantage points here to have the highest average blocking of COVID-containing websites amongst all the countries we studied at 4.32%. This blocking was also quite widespread. Around 65% of vantage points observed the blocking of at least one COVID-containing website. We thought this was strange because Switzerland is a free country and COVID-containing websites should be accessible given that they are some of the top search domains. Digging deeper, we found that a vast majority, or 99% of vantage points, were shown IP addresses hosting one of these three block pages whenever they observed blocking of domains. And most of the domains being resolved with the IPs with these block pages were COVID-containing domains. You can see here that a lot of the block pages hint at some kind of URL filtering or ISP filtering going on, which relies on categorizing websites. The one in the top right shows use of the Zscaler filter. The one in the bottom left shows the Swisscom ISP doing filtering. We actually found this particular block page in the bottom right to belong to Fortinet, which has a web filtering service called FortiGuard. FortiGuard also has a freely available online URL categorizing tool, so we wanted to use it on our COVID-containing websites. We were very curious to see what categories it assigned to them, which would have led to this filtering. We found that a vast majority of blocked domains were categorized as phishing or malicious. In fact, the top 10 DNS filtered domains in Switzerland were all classified as phishing or malicious, and were all from our COVID-containing test list. Looking elsewhere, we also observed similar patterns of URL filtering of COVID-containing websites in other free countries such as Croatia and Canada, causing higher than expected average blocking rates over there. Seeing these results, we naturally wondered, are these websites actually dangerous? We wanted to see how other URL filters besides FortiGuard were categorizing these websites. So we found a categorization of websites filtered by FortiGuard using three other URL filters available online. And these were WatchGuard, Checkfish, and Palo Alto networks. We also decided to manually visit these websites to inspect them for phishing or security threats. So 3 authors individually visited the websites and then came to a consensus. So what did we find? Well, firstly, we found drastic differences in the categorization amongst URL filters. Around 0 to 37% of websites were classified as risky, depending on the filter used. And this is excluding FortiGuard. You can see here in the table that there's a lot of variance in the categorization. From our manual inspection, we found that there were no visible potential threats in all but one website, which had a potentially insecure pop-up where card information could be entered. In fact, most of these websites were just COVID-19 statistics websites, and many of them even warned their users about inaccuracies in their data, and also mentioned their sources, which often included Johns Hopkins University and government websites. This picture shows one of the widely blocked COVID-containing websites. So, what are the implications of what we found? Well, first of all, there are large discrepancies from filter to filter, even in this relatively smaller example. Given the variance, some of the filters are bound to be wrong. These filters are used very often by organizations, internet service providers, and governments for blocking dangerous websites. And this would cause unnecessary blocking for thousands of users without them even realizing it during a time when information access is crucial. Like several other previous works I found, we also found that there is a lack of proper auditing for web filter-based censorship, and a lack of transparency about the decisions that they are making. Despite what we uncovered, though, our study definitely has its limitations and certainly does not cover the entire scope of COVID-19 internet censorship. To begin with, we only focus on the censorship of factual content, but others can focus on the censorship of pandemic misinformation, which is also a big problem. Our study also only focused on application layer and DNS blocking, and not some other types of blocking like content removal on platforms like Twitter. Our study did not take into account any censorship that search engines may have done. Although it should be noted that factual information is less likely to be censored in this way by search engines than misinformation is. Many people are concerned that authorities may use the pandemic as a reason to keep censorship in place right now and even after it ends. So future work can investigate the overflow censorship policies enacted during the pandemic over time. Lastly, we only use Western search engines Google, DuckDuckGo, and Bing for our crawls to find top URLs. Future works can also incorporate non-Western ones such as Yandex or Baidu to gain a more complete picture of censorship. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to reach out to me or any of my co-authors if you have questions.